Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the GoldSilverBitcoin Show, brought to you by the GoldSilverBitcoin.com store. We are more than honored today to be sitting down with Kristoffer Hansen. Kristoffer is a research assistant at the Institute for Economic Policy at Leipzig University. He received his PhD from the University of Angers and is a former Mises Institute Research Fellow. Thank you so much, Kristoffer, for joining us today. Was all that information up to date?
Yeah, that's pretty up to date. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us.
It's pronounced University of Angers. It's in France, so
Angers. Angers, yeah, great. I thought it was something different than anger. Well,
yeah.
All right. So you've got your articles at Mises Institute. I came across them recently. There's a lot of stuff to go into there. Some of them we'll go into a little bit later. I wanted to speak about the economy currently. So I guess my first question is that from a historical perspective, where do you think the world is economically currently?
In uncharted territory. I mean, the easy answer is that we're heading for, or we are in a period of high inflation. And central banks think that they can just keep on using their old policy tools to tame it. But I don't think that's going to work anymore. So the question is, are we just going to keep on expanding the money supply however we can to avoid the recession, or are we going to not do that to stop the expansion, leading to a massive recession? I mean, the recession is going to come, of a depression, whatever you want to call it. But the question is it now this year, or is it, or can they postpone it another year, 5 years, or whatever? I haven't looked at American data recently, but I just this week I was looking at trying to pull some data together to write something on my home country of Denmark, and there you can see, if you just look at construction numbers, that new construction of new homes, residential construction is way down in the second half of 2021, and here fall of 2022. New mortgage lending is also way down. And it looks like that the Danish central bank is again trying to step in to goose lending along. As I said, I don't know if that's going to succeed, and I think it's the same picture everywhere in the Western world, at least.
I think so, generally, and especially at the macro trend level. Some of the events we've seen have been so massive that it's tough to counteract them. You mentioned that in an article called Bretton Woods and the Spoliation of Europe, that we've recently reached the 50th anniversary of the August 15th, taking the last pegs of the dollar from the gold standard.
Yeah.
And here in, I guess, this is the 51st year, we've seen some in the US, especially an inflation that hasn't seen since at least the 1970s. The official rate is, I believe, 8.7%. The likely rate is 10% higher, I believe. And you can look at sites such as shadowstats.com to kind of investigate further on those numbers. You mentioned construction. So I imagine that in the US, we're the tale of two countries, really. I believe that because of the states' rights issues, where each state is able to create its own laws, that people are moving to those that had what they view as more sensible policies over the last 2 years, or just better opportunities to raise a family, et cetera. So I think that in many states across the US and in middle America, there's probably states which are seeing a explosion in new construction. Whilst the coast, we saw California lose population for the first time, I believe, last year, is probably slowing quite a bit. Overall, though, according to Bloomberg, let's see, in an article published April 19th, U.S. housing starts unexpectedly rise to fastest pace. U.S. housing starts unexpectedly rise to fastest pace since 2006. Construction reaches 1.79 million pace on multifamily projects. Number of homes under construction continue to rise in March. I must surmise that this is driven largely by what's going on in the middle America. So let's talk about now. We're in the 51st year of being depaid from the gold standard. You wrote in Mises.org that let's see here. Having marked the 50th anniversary of the destruction of the gold standard Sunday, August 15th, it is natural to be a little nostalgic for the Bretton Woods system. After all, it might not have been the classical gold standard, but at least it wasn't as bad as the fiat standard that succeeded it. Can you speak more about what we're seeing here in the 51st year of I would call the end of the Bretton Woods system, really, and then we're in this post-Bretton Woods period, which we have to then define.
Yeah. Well, one element of continuity between Bretton Woods and the modern system, or the modern non-system, is the central role of the American currency, the American central bank, and by extension, the American economy for the global financial system. And that's been the same, or even been more accentuated as the years have progressed since the end of Bretton Woods. The key difference, as I see it, between the system back then and the way it functions now is that you did have an escape vehicle, so to speak, in Bretton Woods, in that you could, foreign central banks, European central banks, Asian central banks, could turn in their US dollars for physical gold. And that, in theory, should discipline American inflation or American money creation. But obviously, you cannot do that anymore. That's what changed in 71. But that didn't really lead to a decline of the American dollar in relative to other currencies. It just led to worldwide inflation because everyone was now off gold and everyone could inflate, or at least they took the opportunity to, when they had like an inflow of American dollars, for instance, when they would just inflate their own currency on top of it. So that's the base, and you see that to this day, that I think when you look at the reserve holdings, total reserve holdings of central bank across the world, when American dollars, or rather dollar-denominated assets, are about 50 to 60% of all reserves. I mean, there's like it oscillates a bit, but it's in that region. What we are seeing now, so I mean, this has just continued, of course. Actually, some periods worse than others. There was like a period in the 90s where at least it looked like inflation was more moderate, but that was succeeded by the more, shall we say, obvious inflation of the 2000s. What we are seeing now, I mean, since we do have economic problems emerging in a lot of different economies around the world, what people usually do is that we have this flight into safe assets. And among currencies, the dollar to this day is the safest of currencies. If you don't want to hold gold, or you cannot hold gold or other safe assets, but I guess we can discuss later on if you want, then you want to change your euros or yen or whatever, and your euro assets and yen assets or whatever, into dollars and dollar assets. So I think what we are seeing, and what I think might accelerate if like the global economy continues sliding, is a flight into the dollar, a capital flight from Europe and other parts of the world into the US. Which means that, you know, the economic downturn might not be so bad for the Americans. The dollar will appreciate relative to other currencies, and the yeah, I mean, it's not like it will neutralize completely any need for adjustment. Obviously, there's a lot of domestic problems in the American economy that might need an adjustment. But globally, the Americans will actually be in a good position during an era of crisis or period of crisis as we are in, as I think we are in right now.
That's a byproduct of being the world reserve currency. So I suppose that doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon, but there's been cataclysms. And I think this is something that from the natural sciences we can borrow, like regardless of what one believes about the theory of evolution. I think that school evolutionists have evolved to the point where they cite the effect of cataclysms on the process of evolution over time. So instead of just a slow, steady change over time, that events can happen which change things dramatically. Let's say an asteroid hitting the planet and causing dinosaurs to go extinct, for instance, would be an example of that. And likewise, the IMF dubbed Great Lockdown in 2020 would be another such event. I guess the Russia-Ukraine war might be categorized as another such event. These just kind of unexpected black swan events that really changed the course of history, as we've seen with our own eyes over the last couple of years. Now, in the article, Bretton Woods and the Spoliation of Europe, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in Europe. You write, the social engineering was on full display when international delegations from 44 nations came to the resort town of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in July 1944 to agree on how the international monetary system should be set up after the World War. However, in reality, the system was an American diktat. While the Europeans were not completely without influence, they were all either bankrupt or still occupied by German soldiers, whereas the Americans were now creditors to the world and sitting on a pile of gold that had flowed into the country in the 1930s and during the war. As Ben Steil documents in his account of the conference, the system agreed upon was essentially that proposed by Harry Dexter White, the creature of Henry Morgenthau. The more inflationary plan proposed by Keynes was never really a serious alternative, although the arrogant and insufferable behavior of Keynes at the conference probably didn't do the British any favors. And Keynes also criticized the arrangements at the end of World War I, stating that the peace would be short-lived. And I guess he also had protestations about the Bretton Woods system. So, Kristoffer, my question is, can you take us back to New Hampshire in 1944 and tell us about that conference?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good example of what you just said about cataclysms, because no one expected in the 30s that they would be sitting there like less than 5 years later and be redesigning the international monetary system. So, well, you set up most of it. So, of course, the Americans held all the cards. They had all the gold. It had drained from Europe to America during the 30s and during the Second World War. And the Americans had become the creditor to Great Britain and to everyone else, basically, during the war. So obviously they were by far the strongest player at the conference and could more or less dictate how the system was going to look. Part of it, I mean, so the Bretton Woods system as it emerged was basically what the Americans had said they wanted. It was basically the American plan, or Harry Dexter White's plan, that was adopted. The British delegation had a lot of prestige for being, for having fought the Germans the longest, and for having borne the brunt of the war and so on. What the British wanted was basically a more inflationary system. They wanted, because they had built up a lot of debt during the war, naturally, so they wanted someone else to help them carry the burden, or they wanted to shift it onto the global monetary system through something, I think it was called the currency union that Keynes proposed, that that would basically create new credits to countries that were in a debtor position internationally. And while the Americans were sympathetic to this, at the end of the day, it was a question of power, and they weren't going to give the British anything just because they liked them, to put it mildly. So the system they set up in Bretton Woods had one key currency, the US dollar, that was linked to gold, pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. But it only worked in such a way, it worked in such a way that only foreign central banks or foreign monetary authorities could redeem dollars for gold. It wasn't open to American citizens, and it wasn't open to foreigners either. So it was set up to make the American dollar the central currency for everything, for world finance, for world trade, and so on. And then you had, as I said earlier, you had this like safety, this escape vehicle that you could convert into dollars to try to enforce some discipline, or if you were unhappy with accumulating dollars. The other currencies were linked to the dollar at fixed exchange rates. So in theory, all the exchange rates were fixed, and you had to, so it's not like today where currency rates fluctuate all the time. You had some countries periodically engage in devaluation because imbalances had built up too far for it to be sustainable any longer. So you can think of it, some of your viewers or listeners might be familiar with the classical inverted pyramid way of seeing the money supply, that you have base money, gold at the bottom, then you have a layer of credits with the central bank on top of that, and then on top of that you have the money produced by commercial banks, so commercial bank deposits on top of that. And you can think of international system in the Bretton Woods area in the same way. So you had gold at the bottom, dollars on top of gold, and then all other currencies on top of the dollar. And everything in theory redeemable in gold, but there's a very long way from the top to the bottom, so to speak, in this system. One thing it's important to realize is that for a long time, for 14 years to be exact, the Bretton Woods system didn't really function. That is to say, it wasn't allowed to function because all the European currencies were pegged at too high a valuation. So you talked all through the 50s about a dollar shortage in Europe. The Americans needed to, it was all the Americans' fault. They needed to come and create more money, spend more money, give us some money, give us some dollars so we can make the system function. It's basically what the Europeans said. But of course, the shortage is only there because you've chosen to peg the currency at too high a level for whatever reason. Usually that you wouldn't, if you chose a lower peg, you would be admitting that you have engaged in inflationary policies in the past, and that was usually, shall we say, not popular, or it would look like a loss of prestige or something. So no one wanted to admit that in Europe. The Marshall Plan was partly a way to alleviate this problem, simply because what was the Marshall Plan? It was a massive transfer of dollars from America to Europe. So while it was in operation for a few years, you didn't have this problem, but obviously you weren't going to just shower wealth on the Europeans forever. So when it wound up again in the early 50s, this dollar shortage reemerged. It only disappeared in 58, in late 1958, because the Europeans finally admitted that we have to devalue our currencies to make them actually convertible into dollars. And the British and the French, I think, were the last to do this. So what then happened, because then you might think, well, in theory now everything is fine and dandy and everyone can just engage in trade and financial transactions. And you can clear it in dollars and you can redeem in gold once in a while if you want to. But what actually happened in 58 was that now that dollars started flowing into Europe, all the Europeans started engaging in inflationary policies of their own. So they received the dollars and they inflated on top of it. You sometimes get the impression that at least they pretended to say, oh man, we don't want to inflate, but we just receive all these dollars and we just enter our banking system. So it just happens automatically that we have to inflate to keep the currency valuation we've chosen now. But of course, there was no law against the country revaluating its currency if it wanted to. And countries like Germany repeatedly had to revalue their currency to stem the flow of dollars, the flow of inflation from this source. And of course, the Americans also started engaging in a lot more inflation from the late 50s on to fund welfare programs in the war in Vietnam and so on and so forth. So the system really only functioned from late 58 until 68. Because in 68, and I should say all through this time period, it wasn't just like you had a small flow of gold out of America and sometimes an inflow. No, you had a massive inflow starting from the early 60s, because the Europeans too wanted to inflate, but not at the same rate as in America. So they started to redeem more and more gold. And famously, the French sent a warship to New York to get their gold holdings. That might have been in 68, or it might have been a bit earlier. So in 68, what happened was that there had continuously been upward pressure on the gold price, on the official price of $35 per ounce. Because you also had private gold markets, of course, especially in London and Zurich. And in 68, the central bankers of the world, led by the American central bank, of course, said, we are going to just ignore whatever happens on the private gold market. They can do whatever they want. In reality, we'll just keep exchanging gold at the official par of 35. And as soon as they did this, the free market price rose significantly above. So to something like $40. So nothing by today's standard, of course, but still a significant percentage increase. Which, if you think about it, of course, only further incentivizes the Europeans to redeem dollars for gold, because they can see in the free market that the dollar is worth much less than the official par. So in 71, in August 71, the Americans realized, or the American Central Bank realized, that if this goes on for much longer, we are going to have no gold left at all. So that's when they closed the gold window in August 71. and the system collapsed, or the system ended at that point.
Henry Hazlitt had some thoughts on this, and he wrote that at the time in 1944, I believe, quote, "The belief that only a rich nation can afford a gold standard is a fallacy." As before the Bretton Woods conferences gathered, he wrote, quote, "The greatest single contribution the United States could make to world currency stability after the war is to announce its determination to stabilize its own currency. It will incidentally help us, of course, if other nations as well return to the gold standard. They will do it, however, only to the extent that they recognize that they are doing it not primarily as a favor to us, but to themselves." He went on to speak with passion again about the Bretton Woods arrangement. Quote, "This is a provision which would permit world inflation. Experience has shown that it is extremely unlikely that any government will wish to raise the unit gold value of its currency. The political pressures from time immemorial, and particularly in the last 3 decades, have been in the direction of devaluation and inflation." Hazlitt also wrote, quote, "It would be difficult to think of a more serious threat to world stability and full production than the continual prospect of a uniform world inflation to which the politicians of every country would be so easily tempted. It would be difficult to think of a more serious threat." So the same quote again, twice in the article. Yep. And let's see here. He also opined in an editorial, quote, It would be impossible to imagine a more difficult time for individual nations to decide at what level they can fix and stabilize their national currency unit. How could the representatives of France, of Holland, of Greece, of China make any but the wildest guess at this moment of the point at which they could hope to stabilize? There's no force on the planet that can keep a falling price from dropping once the resources to maintain it are gone.
Yeah.
These are some of the critiques he had of Bretton Woods. Do you have any further comments on Bretton Woods, Hazlitt's take on Bretton Woods, before we move on to kind of speak about the legacy of Bretton Woods?
Yeah, no. Well, I mean, I agree. I think, I mean, if we want to be nice to the people who planned it, we might say that they believe that you needed gold as a reserve asset or as a clearing asset in the system. But if you wanted to have a really scientific international monetary system, it had to be planned. It had to be cooperation between central bankers. But that's of course wrong. I mean, we don't say that we need, if we want a stable market for shoes, we need it to be centrally planned and have central government-run shoe factories and so on and so forth. And money, just like any other thing, anything else in the economy, is a market-produced commodity. So you don't really need any of all this, but that's of course hard to accept, I guess, if you are a treasury official or a central banker and have spent all your life in trying to manage these affairs. So yeah, I mean, so that would be the most positive spin you could put on Bretton Woods. Was it? Yeah, I mean, was it an attempt at a step in the right direction towards a stable international monetary system, but it was just inherently flawed? In reality, I mean, it's very hard for me to accept that they didn't realize the inflationary potential in the system. They could, if they truly wanted a gold standard, which is what it was sold as, any of the countries could just, as you quoted Hazlitt, they could just have adopted a gold standard. It would have been a little more complicated in Europe because most of the European countries were completely devoid of gold at this point in time. But that would just have lasted 1 or 2 years, and then they would have sold stuff to, mainly to the Americans who had all the gold, and would have built up a gold stock again. So they could have a gold standard. And then you just needed, you could have just have had the French adopting a gold standard at whatever whatever exchange rate between the franc and gold that would reflect market conditions, and the British do likewise, and so on and so forth. And in that way, you would have like a decentralized return. You could have had a decentralized return to something resembling the classical gold standard from before World War I, but obviously no one, I think it's fair to say that no one was thinking in these terms any longer, except for people like Hazlitt and Ludwig von Mises, who unfortunately were on the outside of policy discussion at this point in time. And none of the central players had any interest in the discipline that would come with the gold standard.
Hazlitt in the 70s, I believe, was an editor at the New York Times. Mises, what did Mises have to say about Bretton Woods, if anything, that you know off the top of your head?
Oh, I think he would agree with Hazlitt completely. And he said that, yeah, I mean, any country can just decide to adopt the gold standard at any point it wants. You don't need this apparatus. It's, as I said, at best, it's just mistaken, and at worst, it's just an engine of inflation.
The legacy of Bretton Woods, I guess we could probably put that at 1973 and look at that period, 1945 to 1973, and make an evaluation. I think the overall evaluation would be that it didn't last. It didn't work for very long. And then in 1973, as the gold window closes, or was it, is it 73 or is it 71?
It's the gold window closes in 71, and in 73, you have like the officially they give up in 73.
It's not coming back. It's a permanent policy.
Yeah.
That's now a new system post-Bretton Woods. I guess if we could call it post-Bretton Woods, then we could see that there was a failure of the Bretton Woods system. I guess it perhaps gave the United States too much control over worldwide economic policy. The US dollar left the gold standard, and then we moved into this purely fiat phase, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the first fully fiat experiment in history. I guess worldwide. I guess you could argue on a worldwide basis.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, you can try to find parallels,
but they must not have been so insidious as this, as global as.
Yeah.
And now,
before you, I mean, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, before you always clearly had a monetary role internationally for gold and silver, even if some particular country went off gold or had a paper currency for an extended period of time. I mean, the legacy of Bretton Woods, yeah, I mean, it's I think there are two legacies. One is the dominant role of the dollar to this day in international affairs. Because for whatever reason, I mean, obviously nowadays, European central banks have a lot of gold in their reserves, but for whatever reasons, they chose never to try to have a harder currency. I mean, there was a lot of uncertainty in the 70s and the 80s, and a lot of diplomatic negotiation and pressure exerted by the Americans that foreign countries, Japan and Germany in particular, should adopt monetary policies that suited American interests, or whatever American special interests were, had the ear of the White House at the time. So that's one legacy of Bretton Woods, would be the central role of the dollar, even without any gold backing. The other one would be the European Union, or particularly the Eurozone, and the adoption of the euro as a common currency. One of the central goals of the Bretton Woods system was to have was to avoid competitive devaluations between different countries, because people thought, and correctly I think, that one of the main reasons for international conflict in the 30s had been competitive devaluation that had destroyed the world economy and led to various barter agreements directly between countries, and just a cessation of world trade, more or less. So to avoid this, you just try to fix your currencies as they would have been on a gold standard, because, I mean, if you're on a gold standard, your currency is just a weight of gold, whatever weight of gold you choose. And the European countries tried, after Bretton Woods, to continue to fix the European currencies internally between each other to help trade along. But before, they did so by saying they are all really, you know, money substitutes, they're all really fixed to gold. So we're all really clearing our trade in terms of, even if it's just in terms of bookkeeping, it's just like an accounting fiction, everyone is really clearing their trade in terms of gold. And no single country can engage in inflationary policies or two inflationary policies, because if they do so, they'll get a negative balance of payments and be forced to reduce the rate of inflation again. And it actually worked pretty well this part of Bretton Woods worked pretty well, and it worked even better before Bretton Woods in the 50s, when you had intra-European trade and what's known as the European Payments Union that operate from 50 to 58. And it was a clear trade precisely in terms of a unit of account defined in terms of gold. In the 70s, you had various, well, from the 70s on, I should say, you tried various cooperations, European monetary mechanisms of different kinds to, again, fix the currencies in terms of each other, so the trade could flow smoothly without any kind of disturbance. And it invariably broke down because you had a few countries that wanted to have comparatively hard currency, with low inflation, Germany the most important among them. And then you had other countries that wanted to engage in more highly inflationary policies. Italy, for instance. And these discrepancies meant that again and again these attempts at cooperation broke down until in the early 90s, I forget if it's in the 89 or just right in the early 90s, that they finally agree that the only way to get rid of this problem is to have one common currency for all the European countries. The Germans were unsure about this because they feared that if we agree to this, it will be a currency controlled by the Italians or someone else, or by like an alliance of all the inflationary countries against us and the other non-inflationary countries. But they went along with it partly because it was the price they had to pay for German reunification after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and partly because they were promised that the European Central Bank would be modeled on the Bundesbank and would have that its official policy would be low inflation or no inflation. So they went along, and I think it's 19 or 20 countries in the Eurozone, all the major European economies apart from Great Britain, adopted the Euro. And in the first years, it was Yeah, I mean, I think it, again, compared to what it could have been, it was a harder currency than the Germans had feared. But as soon as strains appeared in the system after the financial crisis in 2008, the European Central Bank again and again bowed to political pressure and engaged in inflationary financing of governments, bailing out banks who held government bonds, bailing out governments who couldn't roll over government bonds, and so on and so forth. So they went from official policy being that the European Central Bank cannot own a government bond at all, to nowadays they just buy it directly from the governments whenever someone needs financing. So now we have this again, engine of inflation, just even more so because it's completely unaccountable to anyone except the politicians who like inflation. So
great. So now that leads us to today. And I just came across a quote by Cordell Hull, who's U.S. Secretary of State from 1933 to 1944. And Hull believed that the fundamental causes of the two world wars lay in economic discrimination and trade warfare. Hull argued, quote, unhampered trade dovetailed with peace, high tariffs, trade barriers, and unfair economic competition with war. If we could get a freer flow of trade, freer in the sense of fewer discriminations and obstructions, so that one country would not be deadly jealous of another, and the living standards of all countries might rise, thereby eliminating the economic dissatisfaction that breeds war, we might have a reasonable chance of lasting peace. I'll say that the premise that interconnected trade diminishes war has not played out over the last 2 centuries, I suppose. We see things crop up. I guess there might be a counter to that argument that I'd be open to hearing, but we look at today, fast forward to today, and essentially we're seeing world trade unraveling before our very eyes. Today, Putin told Finland that swapping neutrality for NATO is a mistake, and they've stopped sending energy to Finland, I believe, as of this morning. Russia cuts off electricity to Finland amid growing international tensions. Like, this is essentially just an early phase of a world war, if we look back historically at how these conflicts have broken out. Can you speak to the impact of the last 75 years, Kristoffer, on Europe, where you're currently living?
Yeah. I agree that this it's a bit too optimistic or too naive to think that just if people just trade, war will never happen. Because of course you had the highest degree, the highest volume of world trade you had ever seen in 1913, and then in the summer of 1914 even, and then next month Europe and then eventually the whole world descended into world war. After the so I mean, I think, again, I don't want to give politicians more credit than they deserve, but I think it's correct that the American State Department especially was very focused, after the Second World War, was very focused on returning the world to some kind of free trade and stable international economic conditions, precisely because, as you quoted Cordell Hull saying, because they thought that this economic nationalism had bred the war, had bred many of the conflicts that led to war, which I think is true. But of course, if politicians don't realize the cost, the destructiveness of their policy, whatever aggressive policies we're thinking of, then it doesn't really matter, because, as I said, we don't realize it, so it doesn't enter into their calculations. I think that's so. Yeah, so in Europe you had the sponsorship of this protectorate from the Americans that really pushed free trade. And you had among the post-war political elites in Europe also some appreciation of the fact that we needed to trade with our neighbors instead of having conflicts with them, which enabled free trade policies, which then enabled like a huge increase in prosperity in the post-war period. Today, well, I don't know if I should just go on if you want to say something to that first. Okay, well, today I think objectively it still holds true that if you engage in trade with your neighbors, that's of mutual benefit and will lead to greater prosperity for everyone. But on the one hand, I think some politicians have decided that, the Russians specifically have decided that it's just not worth it to, I mean, the costs to our other interests are too high if we want to keep engaging in trade with the West. And we need to defend these other interests, even if it costs us in the economic sphere. And I think on the European side, partly people nowadays are under the sway of very anti-economic ideologies. Stuff like everything is about climate change and global warming, so you really need to minimize. So economic development, economic growth is not a good in itself. You really need to minimize the impact you have on your planet. And since any economic activity has an impact on the planet, the logical conclusion is that you must say that, well, we need to remove or limit the number of humans and their, let's say, their power to inflict damage on the planet. So people who hold to ideologies like this obviously are not going to really bother that much if they hear that whatever policy they're engaged in is causing a 5% decline in GDP or whatever other measure you want to use. On the other hand, I think most people, like the vast majority of people, still care very much about their standard of living and about being able to pay their bills and so on and so forth. So a politician cannot really indulge these ideologies as far as they'd like. But then enter the central banks, because you can just, instead of having to face the cost up front, either through taxation or through a clear, visible fall in income of the citizens, you can just ask the central bank to print the money that you need, and then at least in the short term, it's going to look like there's no negative impact. I mean, you might say that the price of natural gas, of oil is increasing, but you can just blame that on Putin and then give the citizens a check to cover the difference in price. Or you can do the same thing with food. I mean, you can blame the Russians for blocking Ukrainian and Russian exports of wheat, and then again give people a check if you want to. And since, I mean, I think in America, people, or in the US at least, people are much more aware of monetary issues. But in Europe, it seems to very much have dropped from everyone's radar that you need to be concerned about this. So no one's really pointing to the monetary factor, to the inflation of recent past. And since it hasn't shown up in the form of high price inflation yet, no one takes it seriously. But of course, I mean, we are seeing high price inflation now. We are seeing enormously high oil prices, natural gas prices, food prices, and so on. And we cannot really blame it on Putin, even if we wanted to, because we can see the trend. It started way before the conflict in Ukraine, or the war in Ukraine at least.
Now, can you tell us about the current situation in Europe?
That's a broad question.
I know, whichever you're most comfortable talking about, because there's many directions we can go in. Obviously, we're seeing spiking energy prices all across Europe, and
yeah,
there's a war in Europe, also in Ukraine, in a historically significant part of Europe, Eastern Europe. And something about Central and Eastern Europe, and this is coming from a U.S. perspective, is that it's often been on the border of empires or even civilizations, I suppose, whether it's Austria or Ukraine, etc. So I ask broadly, can you tell us, like, where is Europe at historically, insofar as you're comfortable speaking to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, as I said, ideologically, the people who are in charge very much subscribe to these green ideologies and these broadly progressive ideologies. So I don't think I think if they can get away with it, they'll be fine with just with using this opportunity from their point of view that the war in Ukraine affords to just minimize or limit the consumption of natural gas and oil in Europe, and try to really force a transition to green energies. I think it's going to be a huge waste, to put it bluntly, because I don't think you cannot have an industrial economy like Germany or like Europe just generally being fed by solar and wind energy. It just doesn't work. It's not really my area of expertise, but from everything I've read, if you want to have solar and wind energy, then you need to also have natural gas. And if you shut off the natural gas, then it's going to collapse sooner or later. So, I mean, if they continue down that road, then come the fall, come the winter, it's going to look pretty dicey, to say the least. I was surprised because early on, back in late February, the German government was initially very much emphasizing that the EU and NATO has to remain neutral in this Ukrainian conflict. All our sympathy goes to the Ukrainians and so on and so forth, but we have to stay out of it. And the next day, just like that, the chancellor came out and said, Putin is the devil, the Russians are the worst thing to happen to Europe since Attila the Hun, or something ridiculous like this. So of course, now they are, and he said that we need to engage in rearmament of Germany and so on and so forth. Of course, I mean, you might say, oh, I mean, he just realized finally that the Russians are these evil, anti-progressive, whatever. But it's just hard to take these policies seriously, because the Russians Putin has been very consistent in what he's been saying for the last 15 years, since 2007 or so. He's always been saying the same thing, that he wants, whatever you want to call it, a Russian sphere of influence, and no American or NATO troops on Russian borders, and so on and so forth. You may not like it, but it's been very consistent. And throughout this same period, all the European countries, with a partial exception of France and an exception of Poland, have been reducing military spending to close to non-existent levels, so close to 1% of GDP, even in large countries like Germany. So of course, it is not really serious to be afraid of the Russians all of a sudden when the Russians haven't changed for the last 15 years at least, while you've been engaging in reducing your military capabilities. And then all of a sudden now realizing we need to expand them again. So I just think that, well, people can think about what they want. I think it shows that it's very unpredictable what people like the German Chancellor and the other European leaders are going to do. On the other hand, you had the Italian, I think he's Prime Minister now, Mario Draghi. He was in Washington recently and gave a press conference with his counterpart. And if I read it correctly, he basically said, well, yeah, we are still trading with the Russians. We are not respecting these sanctions. They are full of holes. We're not going to respect them. We have opened an account with Gazprom Bank and we are paying in rubles now. So if that's the attitude of the Italians, and we know the Hungarians are very much against any kind of further hostile movement, further sanction on the Russians, then I think it's hard to see how much longer they can go down in a confrontational path. But I don't know. It's very hard. I wouldn't have expected them to go this far to begin with.
Economic policy, that's your field, I suppose. So
yeah,
what's the intersection of like Austrian economics and economic policy? What would a Mises-minded, or rather, what would a Austrian-minded academic or policymaker bring to the table in policy discussions? I spoke with Danielle DiMartino Booth, who used to work in the Federal Reserve and considers herself of the Austrian school. And I asked her, were there any other Austrians in the Federal Reserve while she was there? And she said there might have been in the basement somewhere. Now, economic policy and Austrian economics, can you break that down?
Well, the basic thing we would bring to the table would be a laissez-faire position in whatever policy area it is you're concerned with. They're different. It's not that just because you are an adherent of Austrian school, you have to be like a laissez-faire radical. But the way Austrians analyze the economy is just pretty clear generally that the laissez-faire policy, that is, enforce private property rights, respect private property rights and freedom of contract, and just let the state have the state getting out of the way, will lead to the most desirable outcome. That's to say, you will have the most productive economies, the most efficient use of resources, the most robust financial systems and monetary systems, and so on. So, that's a very general statement, and then you obviously need to go down to on an individual level at the specific policies and see what happens. For instance, I'm teaching a class in international economics, and last week we were discussing trade in endangered species. So you have this, it's called the Washington Convention, or the CITES Convention. I forget what the acronym stands for, that basically regulates or bans trade in endangered species, animal and plant species, with a view because you want these species to survive. You want them to ideally not be endangered anymore. And then you need to sit down and ask, well, why do people trade in these? First of all, will a prohibition lead to the end of trade? Obviously not. Just because you prohibit a thing, demand doesn't go away. You just raise cost and you shift trade into illegal channels. Secondly, why I think that trade in itself is damaging or endangering for these animal species, for elephants or rhinoceri or whatever it is. There's free trade in cattle, and last I checked, there are millions and millions of cows on the earth, and great variety of subspecies of breeds and so on. So it doesn't look like trade in itself should be harmful to animal species. But the core difference between domesticated animals like cows and pigs and so on and so forth on the one hand, and wild animals like rhinoceri and elephants, is that you can own cows and you cannot, it's illegal to own the elephants. So if you want so with elephants, what you mainly want are the tusks, the ivory. So if you want them, you shoot an elephant on the savannah and harvest the tusks and leave. If you're allowed to own the elephant and own the savannas, I mean, you need a lot of room, obviously, for a herd of elephants. Then you would have an interest not only in harvesting the tusks, not only in the immediate income from the trade, but also in the capital value you could have in the elephants and in the savannah and so on. I'm not sure if that's necessarily a specifically Austrian point, but I think in general Austrians are good at understanding the role of ownership and exchange, and in looking at these interconnections between different parts of the economy.
Any other thoughts, Kristoffer, on any of the topics we've discussed today, and maybe a comment on kind of what sensible economic policies, for instance, the ECB or any European member could embark upon in order to avert disaster?
That of course depends on how you define disaster. I don't think, I mean, at this point, I don't think in Europe or anywhere else you can have a reform of the monetary system that's not accompanied by some kind of financial crisis, or some kind of financial credit deflation. You can, I mean, the best you can do in that case would be to see how you could mitigate it. Or, I mean, if you want to mitigate it, or how you could ensure that it doesn't fall on the weakest members of society or something like this. So, I mean, that kind of disaster, I don't think you can avert. You can at most just try to push it into the future a little more. More fundamentally, I think we are heading towards a deeper monetary and financial disaster if the ECB keeps going down the path it's chosen. And I've already mentioned that I think we are seeing capital flight from Europe to the US. And that's only going to intensify. I mean, if the American Fed keeps this less inflation compared to the ECB, this less inflationary policy, then that's only going to intensify, and that's going to lead, excuse me, to harder times in Europe. I mean, the problem is that the ECB is so far out now, I think, that it's hard to see how they can come back. But as we said earlier, as Hazlitt said, and as Mises also said, I mean, you can just choose. The gold standard is not something that just happens by nature. It's something you can choose, you can adopt at any point. And so it is with any kind of sound monetary policy. I mean, there's nothing forcing the ECB to continue to inflate. It can simply say that, okay, I mean, we're not going to increase the money supply. We're not going to keep subsidizing the banking system, or rather the governments with these ultra cheap funding. That's not our role. We need to get out of the financial system. We need to freeze the monetary base and ideally return to some kind of commodity standard. I mean, that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen like that, at least. It's more realistic that you have some kind of crisis where countries leave the EU, break the euro, basically, and then I mean, that can then go in different directions. If you have, like, say, Italy and Spain leaving the EU, maybe you can have a harder block in the form of Germany and Netherlands enforcing hard monetary policies. Like, that's going to happen because the Germans too like cheap monetary policy now, cheap money now. Or you can have, like, maybe you can have Italy, Hungary leave, and they on their own decide to adopt hard money. Or you can see, I mean, you can imagine Germany leaving the Union and then they adopt hard money. But if they do that, it wouldn't, I mean, it wouldn't be a question of going back to the Deutschmark, because, I mean, that doesn't exist anymore. You would have to, if you wanted to do that, you would have to try to find some way to convert German euros into Deutschmark again. But I mean, euros are fungible. You cannot look at a bank account or at a euro note and see this is a German note or this is a Spanish note or whatever. So the minute the Germans announced they were going to do this, and if it was expected that this German currency would be a harder currency, so it would appreciate in terms of euro, everyone else, all the Spanish and Italians and French people and so on, would just send all the euros to a German bank, and all the euros would be converted into Deutschmark, so it wouldn't work. I think at this point, if we can imagine a German government that wants to break the European Union, that wants to break the euro, they would have to go back. Again, it would have to be a truly radical reform in terms of a gold standard. I mean, it could be something else different. It's not, we don't have to keep focusing on gold. But the German government is one of the main holders of gold in the world, 3,300 tons, I think the official count is, of gold. So it would be very easy for them to introduce a gold standard. They could just say, we are issuing a new currency, a new gold mark, whatever, 1 gram of gold per mark. So we're going to use notes, and then we're going to coin out the new marks, and then use gold money again. But I mean, that too, it would be such a radical break with the current political establishment, current ruling ideologies, and so on. But I mean, I don't see how it's going to happen.
We've had the honor of sitting down today with Kristoffer Hansen. I came across Kristoffer's work at Mises.org. Thank you so much, Kristoffer, for your work there, and also your work on Twitter, where people can find you at Chris, so KRISMOUST Hansen, HANSEN. Again, that's on Twitter at KRISMOUST HANSEN. Kristoffer, any concluding comments before we wrap up here?
No, thank you for having me. It was fun. I hope I wasn't too long, and I hope I wasn't too depressing here in the end. But I just think we need to be realistic about what we can expect.
I'm doing this show for many reasons. One of the main of which is to kind of speak about those events that we're bearing witness to today, no matter how unpleasant they may be. So, Kristoffer, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Yeah, thank you.